$62. That's what a man's whole life can cost, if the man doing the paying is careless about what he's actually buying. I paid it on a Tuesday in a store that smelled like kerosene and old flour, and I told myself I was doing a decent thing. She didn't see it that way. She stood in my yard with the dust still settling off the wagon wheels, and she looked at my hands, not my face, my hands, and she said 7 words that I have carried for the rest of my natural life. Touch me and I'll leave, I mean it. I want to tell you I said something wise. I want to tell you I understood, right then, what a receipt with a woman's name on it does to a person's insides. But I was 34 years old, and I'd never once in my life had to think about what my own kindness cost somebody else. And the truth is I just stood there counting the fence posts behind her, because that's what I do when I'm frightened, and I don't want anybody to know it. 22 posts, 11 of them leaning. This is the story of the year that came after. It's got a horse in it that nobody could rope, an old deaf man who couldn't cook, a brass tag punched with the letter H and the number 9, and a piece of paper that I should have burned the first night and didn't. Some of it I'm proud of. Not much. Touch me and I'll leave. The heat that September had gone past honest and into something spiteful. I remember that first because it's what I was looking at when she said it, the air over the corral, wobbling, the way it does when the ground's given up all it had by 10 in the morning, and the rest of the day is just the sky taking. My shirt had dried salt on it in rings, like a tree stump. Governor, my one-eyed mule, stood in the shade of the wagon with his head down and his ears flat back, and he was making that low grinding noise he makes when he wants everyone to know he's been personally insulted. And she was standing in the middle of my yard with a bundle under her arm the size of a loaf of bread, and that was everything she owned. Touch me and I'll leave, she said. I mean it. She said it in English. Flat, careful English, the kind that's been sanded down by somebody with a ruler in their hand. She wasn't looking at my face. She was looking at my hands, and my hands were hanging at my sides doing absolutely nothing, and I still felt like I'd been caught at something. I said, all right. That's it, that's what I said. 2 words. I've had 20-some years to think of better ones, and I never have. She waited. I understood later what she was waiting for, the part where a man says all right and then explains why it doesn't apply to him. She stood there in that white blast of light with the dust settling on her boots, and she waited for me to keep talking. I didn't. I turned around and I started unhitching Governor, and I counted the buckles as I went. 6 buckles, then the traces. Then the collar, which is a 2-hand job, and gave me something to look at that wasn't her. Behind me, I heard her breathe out. Just once short. I ought to back up. My name is Wesley Tandy, and in the fall of 1884 I had 411 acres in Cottonwood Draw, southeast of Bowie in the Arizona Territory, which sounds like a great deal more than it was. Most of it was rock. What wasn't rock was mesquite, and what wasn't mesquite was a seep that ran good in March and turned to green mud by July, and by September was a dark stain on the ground that flies liked. I had 31 head of horses. I'd had 64 in the spring. I could tell you where every one of the 33 went, and none of the stories are interesting. My brother Dell had started the place. Dell was the one with the eye for a horse and the tongue for a buyer, and the general belief that the world was arranged in his favor. He died in March of 1882, when a horse he'd been warned about went over backward on him in the Wilcox stock pens in front of about 40 people, and I've been told by several of those 40 people that it was quick. I have never asked how they knew. I got the place, I got the debts, I got Hoke Vance. Hoke had been Dell's hand since before I came out from Missouri. He was somewhere north of 65, and he'd gone deaf in his left ear from a lifetime of standing next to shotguns, and in his right ear from what I can only describe as spite. He cooked for us both, and everything he made tasted like a thing that had been punished. He could still rope better one-handed at 65 than I could two-handed at 34, and he knew it, and he had a way of not saying so that was louder than saying so. And I count. I've done it since I was a boy. When something's coming that I can't stop, my mouth goes dry and my head starts counting whatever's in front of me. Fence posts, heartbeats, the seeds in a split gourd, the 41 nails in the porch step. Dell used to laugh at me for it, and once near the end when he was drunk and being honest, he said it was the only thing about me he envied, that I could take a thing that was too big to look at and turn it into numbers small enough to hold. I have Dell's watch. It's been broke since the day he died. I wind it every night anyway. I know how that sounds. The store in Rutherford Wells belonged to Ansel Colley, and Ansel Colley belonged to nobody, which he'd tell you himself, usually within 4 minutes. He was a freighter first, and a storekeeper second, and something else third. And it was the third thing that had a woman sweeping his back room in September of 1884. I'd gone in for wire, that's all. 6 spools of smooth wire and a sack of coffee and a box of 44s, and I was standing at the counter counting out coins when I heard the broom. You don't think about a broom, but there's a rhythm to sweeping when a person's doing it because there's dirt, and there's a different rhythm when a person's doing it because stopping is worse. This was the second kind. It went on, even, patient, mechanical, in a room that could not possibly have had that much dirt in it. Colley saw me listening, and he grinned at me like we were friends. Agency placement, he said, out of the school at Tucson, placed out for domestic work. She's got 2 years and 4 months to run on the indenture. He said indenture the way a man says a word he's practiced. $62 to me for the transfer if you're interested. Cook, clean, whatever you got. Hell of a bargain, Tandy. I'm losing money on it, and I'll tell you why. She won't talk, won't say a word to a customer. Bad for business. I said, why would I want that? Because your brother's dead, and old Vance is cooking, is why. That was a fair point, and it made me hate him. I said, where's she from? San Carlos. He was already wrapping my wire. Chiricahua, don't let the dress fool you, she's the real article. He leaned in. He had a smell about him, bay rum and something underneath the bay rum. Between us, she's had some trouble here, nothing I couldn't handle, but a man wants a peaceable house. And that, nothing I couldn't handle, that's the part. That's the sentence that cost me $62. I've turned it over 1,000 times. I want to say I acted out of decency. And there was decency in it some, the way there's water in a well that's mostly rock. But I'd be lying if I didn't tell you there was also a good bit of I don't like Ansel Colley, and here is a way to take something off him. And there was a third thing under that, which I didn't see for months, which was that I was lonesome in a way I'd have denied at gunpoint, and here was a way to have a person in my house that didn't require me to be worth anything. I paid. He wrote out the paper. He did it slow, enjoying himself, and he read it back to me out loud, and I remember the room went quiet because the broom had stopped. Transfer's all right. Title and interest in the labor contract of the Indian woman known as Ruth. I said, that's not her name. Colley looked up. It's the name on the school roll. That's not the same thing. He laughed and kept writing. She came out from the back with the broom still in her hand. She was maybe 25, 26. She had on a gray mission dress that had been made for somebody 4 inches shorter, and there was a burn scar on the inside of her left wrist, old, shiny, in the shape of nothing in particular. Her hair was cut short. That was the thing that hit me, and I didn't know why yet, that somebody had cut her hair off and it had grown back to her jaw, uneven. She looked at the paper on the counter. She didn't look at me at all. We rode out at 2 in the afternoon, which was foolish, and I knew it was foolish, and I did it because I wanted to be gone from that store before I understood what I'd done. 12 miles. It took us 4 hours. Governor was in one of his moods. She sat on the far side of the wagon seat with her bundle in her lap and her spine straight as a rifle, and she did not speak. And I did not speak, And the wheels went around and the mesquite went by, and my mouth got drier and drier until I was counting the fence posts of a fence that wasn't there. About an hour out, I said, "There's water in the jug behind you." "Nothing." About 2 hours out, I said, "It's not far now." "Nothing." About 3 hours out, I said, "And God help me," I said it in a bright, helpful voice, the voice a man uses on a horse, "You'll have the house. I've got a bunkhouse. Me and Hoke'll be in the bunkhouse." And she turned her head and looked at me for the first time since the store. She had a way of looking at a man that I can only describe as taking inventory, not angry. Worse than angry, she was pricing me, working out what I'd cost her and when. She said, "Why?" Her voice was low and rough from not being used. I said, "Why what?" "Why would you sleep in the bunkhouse?" And I opened my mouth to say something about propriety, and I heard how it would sound, and I shut it again. She turned back to the road. "You'll want something," she said, not to me, to the road. "Everyone wants something. The ones who say the bunkhouse want it slower, that's all." I did not have one single word to say to that. I counted the ruts. There were a great many ruts. Then the yard and the dust, and touch me and I'll leave. I mean it, and all right. And Governor grinding his teeth in the shade like the world's worst witness. Hoke came out of the barn. He stopped when he saw her. He had a coil of rope over one shoulder, and he stood there with his hat pushed back, and his old scalded-looking face doing nothing at all. And I braced myself, because Hoke Vance had opinions about this territory that he had earned in ways I didn't want to know about and had never once asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said loud, the way deaf men do, "You cook?" She said no. "Good," Hoke said, "neither do I." And he walked past her into the house, and came out 10 seconds later with his blankets under his arm and his coffee tin on top of them, and went to the bunkhouse without another word. And that was Hoke Vance's entire opinion on the subject, delivered in 4 words, and I have never in my life admired a man more. She didn't sleep in the house. I found that out the second morning. I came up from the bunkhouse before light to start the fire, and the house was cold and the bed hadn't been touched. The blanket was folded on it in a square with corners like a schoolhouse, and it had a fine layer of dust on it already, and she was outside. She'd slept against the north wall of the barn, in the open on the ground, with her bundle under her head. I stood in the dark, and I did not know what to do with my face. She sat up when she heard me. Instantly, not the way a person wakes, the way a person stops pretending. I said, "There's a bed." "I know where the bed is." "It's 40 degrees out here." "I know what it is out here." I stood there. I counted my own breaths and got to 9 before I said, "Is it the house?" And she looked at me in the gray light and she said, "It's the door." I said, "The door's got a bar on the inside. You can bar it. Nobody could." "The bar's on the inside of your house," she said. I want you to understand that I did not get it. Not right then. I stood there like a fence post and thought she was being unreasonable, and I went and started the fire, and it was 3 or 4 days before it came to me while I was mending wire in the north pasture, and I had to sit down on a rock. The bar's on the inside, but it's his house, and a bar you're allowed to use is a bar somebody can take away. I sat on that rock a while. Here's what the first month looked like. She worked. She worked like something was chasing her, but she would not be seen working. That's the only way I know to put it. I'd come in at noon and the water barrel would be full, and I'd never once seen her carry water. I'd ride out at dawn and come back at dark, and there'd be bread. Actual bread, not the geological event Hoke made. I never saw her make it. Once I came around the corner of the barn fast, and caught her with a hoe in her hands in the little garden patch Dell had scratched out and never used, and she stopped dead and stood absolutely still with the hoe held away from her body, like she'd been caught holding a knife. and I understood that she was waiting to find out if this was going to cost her something. I said, "That's good ground for squash." And I kept walking, didn't look back. It was the hardest thing I'd done in a year, not looking back. She wouldn't eat with us, wouldn't eat in front of us. I'd leave a plate on the porch step, the step with the 41 nails, and go away, and when I came back the plate would be clean and set on the rail, upside down. She wouldn't be inside a building with me in it. If I came in the house, she went out the back, and it wasn't hurried, and that was somehow worse. She'd just be gone, the way a bird is gone. She never called me anything. Not Mr. Tandy, not you. She had a way of arranging a sentence so it didn't need a name in it, and it was so smooth that it took me weeks to notice, and once I noticed I couldn't stop hearing it. I called her Ruth exactly once, on the fourth day, across the yard. She stopped. She stood with her back to me for about the length of time it takes to say the alphabet, and then she turned around and she said, "That's the name they wrote on me." I said, "What should I?" "Nothing," she said. "You'll call me nothing, that's fine, that's fine. People have called me nothing before and I'm still here." And she went into the barn. I never called her Ruth again. For 3 months I called her nothing at all, and I want to tell you how strange that gets, living with a person and never once putting a name to them, and how you start to feel the shape of the hole where the name should be, every single time, 20 times a day, like a tooth that's gone. She wore a tag. I saw it the second week, when she was hanging wash and the wind pulled her collar. A brass tag on a cord around her neck about the size of a large coin, punched with a letter and a number, H9. I knew what it was. Everybody in the territory knew what it was. They tagged people at San Carlos, a letter for your band, a number for you, and you wore it, and the agent counted the tags at ration issue, and that was the arrangement. A man is a letter and a number. There's a ledger somewhere with his whole life in one line. She caught me looking. Her hand went to it, not to hide it, to hold it. "That's not mine," she said. I said, "No. Mine's in a river." Something happened at the corner of her mouth, not a smile, but the place where a smile would have gone if she'd had one to spare. "This is my brother's." And that was the most she'd said to me at one time since the wagon, and I knew, the way you know when a horse is about to move, that if I asked one more question she'd be gone for a week. So I said, "H." "What?" "Just the letter. I'd wondered what the letters meant is all, never knew." And she looked at me for a second and she said, "It doesn't mean anything. That's the point of it." And she went back to the wash, and I went back to the barn, and I sat down on a bucket and put my hands over my face and counted the nails in the wall until I could stand up again. Now the Grulla. Dell bought her in '81 off a man who was in a hurry, which should have been a lesson. Blue-gray mare, 4 years old then, 7 now, and she had wire scars on both forelegs from something that happened before we got her, and she had never in 6 years let a rope touch her without going straight up and over. Not mean, that's what nobody understood. She wasn't mean. She'd take feed from your hand. She'd stand at the fence and breathe on your shirt and let you scratch the hollow under her jaw and half close her eyes about it. She'd let you do anything at all right up until the moment she couldn't leave, and then she'd kill you or die trying one. Dell tried for 2 years. Hoke tried for 1 and Hoke quit her, which Hoke has never done with any animal before or since. Hoke said, "That horse ain't got a bad mind. That horse has got a memory." I'd been feeding her by hand for 2 years and hadn't tried a thing else, mostly out of cowardice that I called patience. I was out there one evening in October with a can of grain, doing what I did, which was stand at the fence and let her come to me and talk nonsense at her, and I turned around and she was there. Not the horse, her. Standing about 20 feet back with her arms folded, watching. I about jumped out of my skin. She said, "How long?" I said, "Ma'am." "That horse, how long have you been standing at that fence?" 2 years, I guess. She looked at the Grulla. She looked at me. And then she did something she had never done, which was laugh one breath of it out the nose, absolutely without joy. "You think you're going to fix her," she said. "I don't think that." "You do. You stand out here with your little can." She unfolded her arms. "You think if you're gentle enough long enough she'll forget." And I heard it, finally. I heard exactly what we were talking about, and my face went hot, and I opened my mouth to say something decent and human, something like "I don't think that about you," something like "that's not what this is." And she cut me off before I got a syllable out. "Don't," she said. "Don't say the thing. I've heard the thing." Then she walked away. I stood there in the dark with the can in my hand and the mare breathing on my sleeve, and I counted the stars over the ridge until I lost track, which took about 4 seconds, because there's 10,000 of them out there, and no man alive can count them, and I think some part of me knew that and picked them on purpose. Collie came out in November. He came in a buggy, which told you something. 12 miles of that road in a buggy. He came at noon and he sat in it and didn't get down, and he called out, "Tandy, you alive out here?" She was in the garden. I saw her go still. She didn't run. That was the thing, she didn't run. And I realized in that half a second that she had decided something about running a long time ago in some other place, and it had gone badly, and she wasn't going to do it again. I walked out to the buggy so he'd have to look at me and not past me. He looked past me anyway. "Well," he said, "she's filled out some. Air agrees with her." I said, "What do you want, Ansel?" "Neighborly call," he smiled. He had a good smile. That's what people never believe about men like that. "How's the indenture running?" 2 years, 1 month left on it now by my count. I said, "I don't keep count." "Sure you do." He tapped his temple. "Everybody keeps count. Here's the thing, Tandy, you got that paper filed with the agency yet?" The world went a little quiet. "Because if it ain't filed," he said pleasantly, "then in the eye of the law that transfer's just an arrangement between 2 white men, which means the contract's still recorded under my name at Tucson, which means if she was to be found at large, and you know how the Army feels about that word this year, with Geronimo out and everybody's hair standing up, well, somebody'd have to come get her, return her to the party of record." I said nothing. I was counting the spokes on his buggy wheel. 14. "I'm not saying I do that," Collie said. "I'm saying a thing can happen." He picked up the lines. "You want to file the paper, Tandy," he said kindly, the way you'd tell a man his cinch was loose. "Only once you file it, it's filed. Government's got it. Her name, your name, all official. Can't unfile a thing." He turned the buggy in my own yard, slow, taking his time, so he could look at the garden the whole way around. Then he was gone, and there was just the dust hanging there, and Governor screaming at the sky about it, and me standing in the middle of my own place feeling like a man in somebody else's house. She came to the bunkhouse door that night. She'd never done that. She'd never come within 30 feet of the bunkhouse after dark. Hoke was asleep and snoring like a saw going through a nail, and I was sitting on the step winding Dell's broke watch, and she came out of the dark and stood there at the edge of the lamplight. She said, "What did he say to you?" I could have lied. I want that on the record, that the lie was right there, easy, and it would have bought me about 4 months. I said, "He says the paper's not filed. He says if it's not filed, the contract's still his on the government's books. He says he could have you brought back." She was quiet. Then she said, "And if you file it?" "Then it's mine on the books, officially." "Then file it." I looked up at her. She was standing very straight, the way she always stood, and her hand was around that brass tag, and her voice was perfectly level, and I could hear underneath it something that had been screaming for about 6 years without stopping. "File it," she said again. "You think I don't know what I am on a piece of paper? I've been on paper my whole life. Roll number, tag number, school number, contract number. Do you know what my mother's name is on the agency book? Squaw of H4, that's it, that's the entry. She had a name that meant something about water, and there's a book in Tucson that says she's the squaw of H4. She stopped. Her breath had gone rough. She got it back. So file it. At least yours would be. She didn't finish. I said, would be what? And she said, nothing. And I said, say it. And she said, nothing. And she was gone into the dark, and the lamp guttered, and Hoke snored on like a man being sawed apart. And I sat on that step with a broke watch in my hand for what must have been an hour. Because I knew what she almost said. At least yours would be a name I'd chosen. And I knew, sitting there, that I was going to file it. Not because of Collie. Because there was no other way to keep her safe. And because there is no such thing as keeping a person safe by owning them. And because both of those were true at the same time and I couldn't put them down. I got out the paper. I read it by lamplight for the first time since the store. Transfers all right, title and interest. I held it over the lamp chimney. I held it there long enough to feel the heat come up through the paper and into my thumb. I put it back in the tin. I'm not going to explain that. There's an explanation, and it's a good one, and I've used it on myself for 20 years, and I'm not going to use it on you. In the morning, she was at the fence at first light with her bundle under her arm. I came up from the bunkhouse, and I saw her there, and my whole body went cold from the scalp down, and I stopped in the middle of the yard about 30 feet off. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the grulla. And the grulla was standing about 4 feet from her on the other side of the wire, with her head low and her ears loose, breathing on the woman's shoulder, and neither one of them was moving at all. I stood there. I counted the posts, 22 posts, 11 of them leaning, same as the day she came. She said without turning around, there's a river at San Carlos. My brother's at San Carlos, or he was in June. I said yes. I'm not asking you to take me. All right. I'm telling you where I'll be. There's a difference, and if you don't know what the difference is, then you and I have got nothing at all to talk about. The sun came up over the ridge and hit the side of her face, and she still didn't turn around, and out in the pasture something, a quail, I think, started up that ridiculous racket they make, over and over, like it's the first morning that ever happened. I said, I know the difference. And she said, the clerk had ink on 3 fingers, and he'd been saying the same sentence to us for 11 minutes. There's no entry. He said it to the ledger. He said it to the window. He said it to the wall behind us, where somebody had nailed up a printed notice about firearms that had been there so long the flyspecks had made their own alphabet on it. He said it every way a man can say a thing except to her face, which was 18 inches from his own, across the counter, absolutely still. There's no entry, he said again. She said, look under H. Ma'am, I have looked under H. Look under H9. There is no. She put the tag on the counter. She didn't slam it. That's what I keep coming back to. She lifted the cord over her head and she laid the brass down on the wood next to his inkwell, quiet as setting down a cup, and the little sound it made went through that room like a rifle shot. The clerk stopped. A soldier by the door stopped scratching himself. Somewhere out in the yard, a mule complained, and even that seemed to happen further away than it had a second before. H9. Punched into brass by a man with a hammer who had punched 400 others that week and had thought about supper the whole time. That's the number, she said. It's in your book. It has to be in your book because your book is the only place any of us exist, so look. And I stood behind her with my hat in my hands like a fool at a funeral, counting the ledgers on the shelf behind that boy's head. 19 ledgers. 19 books with every human being I could see out that window written down in them, 1 line apiece, and not one of those lines long enough to hold a person. Let me go back 4 days. She'd said that morning at the fence, with the sun coming up on the side of her face and the quail hollering like an idiot, she'd said. Then say it back to me. That's what she'd said. I told her I knew the difference between taking her and letting her go, and she said, then say it back to me. Because words were the only currency she had left that hadn't been counterfeited, and she had learned somewhere, at a cost I still don't want to imagine, that a man will agree to anything and mean nothing. So I said it, standing 30 feet back in my own yard at 6 in the morning with my shirt buttoned wrong. I said, you're going to San Carlos because you decided to. I'm not taking you. I'm going the same direction. She thought about it. Then she said, that's close enough to true, and she started walking. Walking, 160 miles near enough, with a bundle the size of a loaf of bread, in November, in shoes the mission had given her. I stood there and let her get about 200 yards. Then I went and hitched Governor. Here is a thing I did that I'm not proud of, and I'm going to tell it anyway, because if I only tell you the parts where I come off decent, then this is just another story about a good man, and I have read enough of those to know they're all lies. I drove the wagon up alongside her at a walk and I said, get in. 2 words, get in, like she was a dog. She kept walking, didn't look up, didn't break stride. I went another quarter-mile beside her with my face burning and Governor grinding his teeth, and I heard my own voice in my head, get in, get in, get in. And I understood something that I'd like to say came to me as a noble revelation, but which actually arrived as pure humiliation, which is that I had gone about 9 hours between saying the right thing at the fence and putting my boot straight through it. It's easy to say the words. Saying the words costs a man nothing. It's the next morning that costs. I stopped the wagon. I got down. I walked around to the far side, away from her, and I sat down on a rock and took my hat off and put it on my knee, and I said, loud enough to carry to nobody, to the mesquite, I'm going to Bowie for wire. It's on the road to San Carlos. There's a seat on this wagon that nobody's using, and I don't care in the least what happens to it. Then I sat there and looked at a rock. I counted the ants going in and out of a crack in it. I got to 31. I lost my place. I started over. I was at 19 the second time when I heard the wagon creak. I didn't look up for a while. When I finally did, she was sitting on the far side of the seat with her bundle in her lap and her spine straight as a rifle, and her eyes on the road ahead, exactly the way she'd sat on the day I bought her. And I want to tell you the difference between those 2 pictures was invisible to anybody in the world but the 2 of us. That's the whole thing right there. That's the whole 160 miles. Nothing about her posture changed. Everything changed. Hoke came. I hadn't asked him. I told him to mind the place, and he'd looked at me with those scalded eyes and said, "Who's minding you?" He rode behind the wagon on his old sorrel with his rifle across the pommel and his hat down, and he didn't say 4 words a day. But at night he'd build the fire in a particular way, small, and off to one side, and always with the wagon between the fire and where she'd chosen to lie down, and he never once explained it, and she never once thanked him, and I have come to believe that was an arrangement the 2 of them made in about a second and a half without a word passing. 3rd night out, Hoke burnt the beans. He burnt them so bad the smell was still on my coat a week later. She said from the dark on the other side of the wagon, "That's on purpose." Hoke didn't hear her, he's deaf. She said it louder, "That's on purpose." Hoke looked up, chewed, considered, said, "Course it's on purpose. Man cooks good, he cooks forever." And out of the dark, one breath, quiet, but it was there, and I heard it, and I sat very still and looked hard at the fire and did not turn my head, because I understood that if I turned my head it would stop and might never come back. She laughed. Not much, not long, about as much laugh as you could hold in a thimble. Hoke went on eating like nothing had happened. But I saw him later, when he thought neither of us was looking. I saw him scrape the pot out real careful and set it aside, and the next night he burnt them again. 65 years old, deaf as a post, smartest man I ever knew. She told me her name on the 5th night, and it wasn't a moment. That's what I want to say about it. Nobody wept. There was no music. I've heard men tell stories where the woman says her name and the whole world tips over, and I'm here to tell you that the whole world does not tip over. It just goes on being a cold night in November with a mule complaining 40 feet away. We were somewhere past the Gila, camped in a wash. Hoke was asleep. I was winding Dell's watch, the broke one, which I do every night, which she had watched me do 4 nights running without comment. On the 5th night she said, "Why do you do that?" I said, "It's broke." "I know it's broke. I can hear that it's broke." "Why do you wind it?" And I opened my mouth to make a joke, because that's what I do, and instead I heard myself say, "Because if I stop, then he's been dead a while." The fire popped. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I figured we were done, and I put the watch away, and I laid down with my hat over my face. Then she said a word. It had a sound in it that my mouth has never been able to make correctly, not in 20 years of trying, and I'm not going to write it down wrong on a piece of paper for somebody to read out loud badly. There's been enough of our words written down wrong. I sat up. She was looking at the fire, not at me. "Don't say it back," she said. "You'll say it wrong and then I'll have to hear it wrong, and I've heard it wrong enough." I said, "All right." It means a thing about the 3rd day of a rain. There isn't a word for it in English. My mother named me in a year when it rained. She turned the tag over in her fingers. The school couldn't write it, so a woman with a pen wrote Ruth, and that took about 4 seconds, and it's been my name for 11 years. I said, "That's not your name." "I know that, you knowing it doesn't do anything." She wasn't being cruel, it was just arithmetic. "You're the only person alive who's heard me say it in 6 years. That's not a gift, Tandy, that's just the arithmetic of who's left." That was the first time she used my name. I laid back down with my hat over my face, and I counted my heartbeats until they slowed down, which took a while, and I didn't let her see any of it, and I'd like the record to show that that was the one and only correct thing I did on that entire trip. San Carlos. I'd never been. I'd heard about it the way everybody heard about it, which is to say, I'd heard men in Bowie say the reservation the way they said the county jail, as a place that existed to hold something so the rest of us didn't have to think about it. It's on the flat. You come down out of the hills and there it is, and the first thing that hits you is that there's no trees, not that they cut them down. There just aren't any, and there never were, and somebody looked at that country and looked at a map and decided that here is where we'll put 4,000 people who came from the high pine country. And then that man went home to a house with a porch on it. The second thing that hits you is the flies. I don't want to talk about the flies. The third thing that hits you is that everybody's counting. That's what I wasn't ready for. Ration day was Wednesday. We came in on a Wednesday. And there's a line of human beings, 1/2 mile of them, standing in the sun. And at the head of it, there's a man with a book. And every person in that line has a tag around their neck, and they walk up and the man looks at the tag and finds the line in the book and makes a mark and hands over the flower. A letter, a number, a mark. 4,000 people, and every single one of them is a line in a book, and the whole apparatus exists to make sure nobody is where they're not supposed to be. And I stood there in my good hat holding a mule by the cheek strap, and I thought, I do this. This is what I do. I count things I'm afraid of until they're small enough to hold. I never counted anything again the same way after that. I still do it. I did it this morning, but I know what it is now. She stood beside me and looked down that line for a long time. Then she said, "Don't say anything about it." I said I wasn't going to. "You were, your face was." She adjusted her bundle. "White men come here and they get sad about it and they say something and then they feel better. Don't do that. If you're going to be sad about it later at your house where it doesn't cost me anything." And she walked toward the agency office, and I followed her, and I have never in my life felt smaller or been more grateful to a person for making me feel that way. Which brings us back to the clerk, and the 19 ledgers, and there's no entry. He looked at the tag on his counter for a long moment. He was young, 22 maybe. He had a boil on his neck and a photograph of a girl propped by his inkwell, and he was, I think, not a bad person, which is the most damning thing I can say about him. He said, "H9, that's a Chiricahua band designation, that's hold on." He got down a different ledger, not one of the 19, one from underneath. He turned pages. I watched her hands. That's how I knew. Her face did nothing at all. Her face never did anything. She'd had that trained out of her by experts. But her hands, down at her sides, had gone white at the knuckles. "Here," he said, "H9 enlisted." She said, "What?" "Enlisted." He turned the book around so we could see, which was the one kindness in him, and I've thought about it since. H9, transferred off the ration roll June of '84, Company B, Indian Scouts, Fort Bowie. Silence. Outside, the line shuffled forward. Somebody's baby was crying, and somebody's mother was making that sound mothers make, which is the same sound in every language there has ever been. She said very slowly, "My brother is a scout." "Yes, ma'am." "My brother is wearing their coat." The clerk looked at his hands. "Yes, ma'am." "Chasing," she stopped. She had to stop. I watched her stop and start again, and it was like watching a man lift a wagon. "Chasing which ones?" The clerk said, "Ma'am, I couldn't." "Which ones?" And he said quietly, "Geronimo's people, ma'am, down in the Sierra Madre. That's what B Company's out doing." I want to explain what that means, and I can't, because I'm the wrong man to explain it. But I'll try badly. Her brother put on the coat of the men who put her family in that ledger, and he took their rifle, and he went down into Mexico to hunt the last free people of his own blood, because they gave him a horse and a wage and $13 a month, and because. And this is the part I only understood years later, in a bar in Tucson, from an old scout with no fingers on one hand. Because the only way anybody got out of that flat, fly-blown, treeless place was to become useful to the people who put them in it. He didn't betray anybody. That's too easy. He was H9. He found the one door out of the book, and he went through it, and the door only went one direction. She stood there. Then she picked her tag up off the counter and put it back around her neck, and she said, "Thank you, to that boy, thank you." She said it, and I nearly went through the floor, and she walked out into the sun. I found her behind the commissary about 20 minutes later. She was standing against the wall with her arms folded and her chin up, and she was crying, and it was the worst thing I have ever watched, because she was doing it silently, and she wasn't wiping her face. She just stood there and let it run and stared at a point about a mile off and did not make one sound. She'd learned that somewhere. You don't learn that at home. I stopped about 10 feet off. I did not move closer. I want that on the record too, because everything in me wanted to move closer, and I have spent a lot of nights since wondering whether the thing that stopped me was decency or cowardice, and the honest answer is that I don't know, and probably both, and probably it doesn't matter, because the result was the same either way, and the result was the only correct thing. I said, "I'll be at the wagon." She said nothing. I said, "I'll be at the wagon for as long as it takes. If it takes till dark, it takes till dark. If it takes a week, Hoke can cook." And she laughed, God Almighty. She laughed through it, wrecked, with her face wet and her jaw shaking, one horrible broken breath of it. And she said, "Don't." And I said, "All right." And I went to the wagon. She came at dusk. She got up on the seat. She sat with her bundle in her lap and her spine straight. She said, "There's a woman here who knew my mother." I said, "Yes." "My mother's under a stone about 400 yards from where you're sitting, 82, the measles year. She said it like a man reading a bill of lading. There's no mark on it. They didn't mark them that year, there wasn't time. The woman showed me which one. She said she thinks it's the right one. I didn't say anything. 20 years of thinking about it, and I still can't come up with what a man says. So there's nothing here, she said. That's what I came 160 miles to find out. There's a stone that might be a stone, and a brother in a blue coat in Mexico, and 4,000 people in a book. Governor shifted in the traces. The lines went tight and slack. She said, "Take me back." And I said, and this is the only sentence I've ever been proud of in my whole life, and it took me 34 years and 160 miles to learn how to say it. I said, "No." She turned her head. "I'll drive," I said. "I'll drive the wagon and you'll sit on it and we'll go the same direction like before, but I'm not taking you anywhere. Not to my place, not to Bowie, not anywhere. You've been taken enough." She looked at me for a long time in that gray light. Then she faced front and she said, "Drive then." And something in her shoulders, I swear this on Dell's watch, something in her shoulders came down about 1/4 of an inch, for the first time since I'd known her, and stayed down. We were 4 days getting back. She talked, not much and not about anything, about the country mostly and about the grulla, and once, for about a mile, about a dog she'd had when she was 6. She wouldn't say the dog's name, but she described the way it sat. On the 3rd day she asked me about Dell. Nobody had asked me about Dell in 2 years. People said sorry about your brother for a month and then they stopped, and I had been carrying him around like a stone in a coat pocket ever since, and she said, "What was he like?" And I opened my mouth and about 40 minutes came out. When I finally shut up, I felt like I'd taken my shirt off in church. She said, "He sounds like a man who'd get killed by a horse." And I laughed so hard Governor spooked and Hoke had to come up and ask what in hell was the matter with us. And she said, "Nothing," and I said, "Nothing." And Hoke said, "Well, quit it," and went back to sulking. And that was the best 4 days of my adult life, and I didn't even know it while it was happening. You never do. We came up out of the draw on the 4th evening. I saw the smoke first and thought, Hoke banked the fire wrong, which is stupid. Hoke had been riding 40 feet behind me for 160 miles. Then we came around the shoulder of the hill, and I saw the yard. There were 4 horses in it, not mine. There was a buggy, 12 miles of that road in a buggy, and there was Ansel Collie sitting up on my porch step, on my step with the 41 nails, with his boots crossed at the ankle and his hat on his knee, and there were 3 men with him, and one of them had a badge on his vest and a paper in his hand. And the corral gate was open. The corral gate was standing open, and there wasn't a horse in it. 31 head, 2 years of hand feeding at that fence with a can of grain and a mouth full of nonsense. Gone. Beside me on the seat she went completely still. I heard her breath go out. Collie stood up. He put his hat on. He smiled that good smile, and he wasn't looking at me. He was never once looking at me. He was looking at the woman on my wagon seat, and he raised his voice pleasantly across 60 feet of my own yard and said, "There she is, told you, deputy, party of record." He held up his hand, and there was something small in it, and it caught the last of the light. "Brass. Man's got to file his paper, Tandy," he said. "I did warn you." That's what he had in his hand, up on my porch step, 60 feet off, catching the last red light off the ridge. He held it up between 2 fingers the way a man holds up a coin to prove it's real, and even from the wagon I could see the shape of it. Round. Cord through the hole. Beside me she made a sound I'd never heard her make, just air. "H9, Collie called out, pleasant as Sunday. "Punched proper. Deputy's seen it. So what we got here is a woman at large off the San Carlos rolls, in the possession of a man with no filed paper, in a year when the territory has got exactly no patience for that particular arrangement." I said quiet out the side of my mouth, You're wearing yours." She didn't look at me. Her hand was at her throat. "Yes." "Then his is." "His is brass," she said. "That's all it is. That's all it ever was. Anybody with a hammer and a punch can make a person." Her voice had gone somewhere I'd never heard it go, flat and far off, like a woman reading her own name off a stone. "That's what I've been trying to tell you since September." The deputy was coming down off the step. Young fellow, round-faced. He had the paper in his hand and he was reading it as he walked, which told me everything. A man who's decided already doesn't need to read. And I sat there on that wagon seat, and my mouth went dry, and my head went straight to work. 4 horses, 3 men, 1 badge, 12 miles to Rutherford Wells and 40 to Bowie, and 160 behind us, and the corral gate standing open on 31 head of horse that were the only thing I had in the world besides 400 acres of rock. I counted it all in about a second and a half, and it didn't help even a little. That's when I understood what counting was for, finally, all the way down. It isn't for solving. It never was. It's for the 4 seconds before you have to do a thing you're afraid of, so you don't have to be there for them. I quit counting. I got down off the wagon. "Wesley Tandy," the deputy said. "That's me. I got a writ of replevin here on 31 head, executed against the estate of Del Tandy on a note held by Mr. Colley, signed by the justice at Wilcox on the 9th. He handed it over. He was polite about it. That's the thing nobody ever tells you, that the worst days of your life get delivered by polite young men with clean fingernails. Stock's already been driven off. That part's done, sir, I'm sorry. That part's just done." I looked at the writ. Dell's signature at the bottom. My brother's hand, big and looping and sure of itself, the way he wrote everything, the way he did everything. $400 against the herd, dated November of '81. 4 months before a horse he'd been warned about put him in the ground. He never told me. 2 years I'd been paying his debts one at a time as they came crawling out of the woodwork, and I thought I'd got to the end of them, and here was one more. Held all this time by a man who'd been waiting for it to be worth something other than money. "Ansel," I said, "how long have you had that note?" Colley was still up on the step, still smiling. "Bought it off the bank in '82. March of '82. April. 3 weeks after they buried my brother. He'd bought it 3 weeks after, for pennies, and he'd sat on it for 2.5 years. And he'd sold me a woman for $62 in September with that note in his safe the whole time. And he'd known the whole time in that store with the flower smell and the bay rum, exactly what he had and exactly when he'd use it." I looked up at him. He tipped his hat to me. And I want to tell you what went through me then. It was not rage. I've been enraged. That's hot and it's stupid and it passes. This was cold and it was patient, and it arrived with a full set of plans, and it said, very reasonably, in a voice that sounded like my own, "You have a rifle under the seat and he is 60 feet away and standing still." Behind me I heard leather creak. Hoke had come up. Hoke Vance, 65 years old, deaf in both ears, sitting his old sorrow with his rifle across the pommel and his hat down, and his hands in absolutely no hurry at all. He wasn't looking at Colley. He was looking at me. And that old scalded face didn't do one thing, didn't warn me, didn't beg me, didn't a damn thing. He just sat there and looked at me and waited to find out what kind of man he'd spent 2 years working for. That's all he did. He made me watch myself decide. I put my hand off the wagon box. Hoke looked away, started rolling a cigarette like nothing. I have never thanked him for that, and I never will, because he'd have said, "For what?" and he'd have meant it. The deputy cleared his throat. He had another paper. "Now on the other matter," he said. "Mr. Colley's made a complaint that there's a ward of the San Carlos agency here off the roll without a pass. Sir, I got to ask you about that. If there's a transfer paper filed, that's the end of it, and I'll ride home and eat my supper." Everything went very quiet. Because it was in the tin. It was in the tin on the shelf in the bunkhouse, 40 feet from where I stood, unfiled, unrecorded, $62 worth of a man's signature saying all right, title and interest. 4 days ago I'd held it over a lamp chimney and felt the heat come up into my thumb, and I'd put it back. I'd put it back. And I could get it right now. I could walk 40 feet and get it and hand it to that round-faced boy, and he'd read it and shrug and say, well, that's all in order then. And he'd ride home and eat his supper. And Ansel Colley would get back in his buggy and go, and it would be over, and she would be safe. She would be safe because she'd be mine on a piece of paper in Tucson. For 2 years and 1 month. I stood there in my own yard in the last of the light, and I understood that I had kept that paper for exactly this. Not for Colley. For this. For the moment when the good thing and the true thing came apart, and I could reach out and grab the good one and tell myself for the rest of my life that I'd had no choice. Every man's got a night like this one waiting for him. Most of us never find out. I found out at 34 years old in a dooryard, with a dead man's debt in my hand. I opened my mouth. And she said from the wagon, there's no paper. The deputy turned around. She was still up on the seat. She hadn't moved. Bundle in her lap, spine straight as a rifle and her chin up, and the light nearly gone. There's no filed paper, she said. He never filed it. He's had it in a tin since September, and he never took it to Tucson because he couldn't stand to. He was going to tell you it was there, and hope you didn't ride to Tucson to look. Colley laughed out loud, actually delighted. Well, hell, he said, there you are, deputy, out of her own. I'm not finished, she said. And there was something in the way she said it. That boy shut his mouth. That badge stopped moving. 3 men and a horse and a whole desert, and a woman on a wagon seat said I'm not finished, and the world waited. You said I wouldn't talk, she said to Colley. 11 months in your store. You told everybody who came in she won't say a word bad for business. You told him that in September in front of me, like I was a mule you were selling. Colley's smile stayed on his face, but something got out from under it. Ansel, she said, and she used his given name, and I watched him take it like a slap. Wednesday nights. 2 years. Your 3rd wagon, not the freight wagon and not the store wagon, the one with the false bed. Nobody moved. Whiskey to San Carlos, she said. 6 barrels a month at $4 the gallon to a man named Yost who has a beef contract and a scale that lies. And in October of last year, 41 rifles. The deputy said, ma'am. 41. Springfields with the government mark filed off, and you did the filing yourself, on the bench in the back room, and you were bad at it. And there's a rasp in the 2nd drawer with brass in the teeth of it right now unless you thought to throw it out, and you didn't because you never throw anything out. She hadn't raised her voice once. I swept that room for 11 months. You didn't stop talking when I came in. Not once, not one time, because I wasn't there. I was nothing. You said it yourself, she won't talk. She looked at him. I'm talking. I want to describe Ansel Colley's face, and I can't quite. Because the light was nearly gone, and because I don't think it settled on any one thing. It went through about 4 faces in 3 seconds. Amusement. Then a kind of scrabbling calculation. Then something ugly and honest for about a 1/4 second, which is the only true look I ever got at him in my life. Then he said, Deputy, she's an Indian, off the roll. Her words not. And he stopped. Because he heard it, same as I heard it. Same as that round-faced boy heard it. Her words not admissible. That's what he was going to say, and it was true. It was legally true in the Arizona Territory in 1884, and he'd have been right, and everybody standing in that yard knew it. But he had to say it out loud. In front of a young deputy who'd been reading a writ instead of thinking, who'd been polite to me, who had clean fingernails and had just heard a specific number, 41, and a specific drawer, and a specific rasp with brass in the teeth. Because here's the thing about a lie like that. It doesn't have to be believed by a judge. It has to be carried by a man 12 miles home in the dark. That deputy stood there for a long moment with the writ in his hand, and I watched him do arithmetic that had nothing to do with law. 41 rifles, Geronimo out, every soldier in the territory sleeping with one eye open, and every rancher's wife in Sulphur Springs Valley scared white, and a man in a store filing the marks off government Springfields on a bench in the back. He said, "What's your name, ma'am?" And she said, "Ruth." I did not move. I stood in that yard with a writ in my hand, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound, and I have never worked so hard at anything in my life. Because I knew what it cost. I was the only person in that yard who knew. Hoke didn't know, that boy didn't know, Collie didn't know, and couldn't have understood it if you'd spent a year explaining. 5 nights before, in a wash past the Gila, she'd said a word to me that had rain in it, and she'd said, "Don't say it back. You'll say it wrong." And she'd said, "You're the only person alive who's heard me say it in 6 years. And now she'd looked a badge in the face and picked up the name a woman with a pen had written on her in 4 seconds when she was 15 years old, and put it on purpose, because it was the only name that could go in a book. You cannot be a witness if you are not a line in the ledger. She'd spent 11 years trying to get out of the book, and to bury the man who put her in it, she had to climb back in and sign it, and be H9 out loud in front of me. That's what it cost. She did it in about 2 seconds, and she never once looked at me, and her voice didn't crack. And I understood standing there that I had spent 5 months feeling sorry for a woman who did not require it and had never required it, and that the entire time, the whole time, from the store, from the broom, she had been holding the only weapon in the county and choosing when to use it. Not out of fear, out of aim. I'll be quick about the rest of it, because the rest of it is procedure, and procedure is boring, and the world is full of men who will tell you the procedure part at length. It took 11 months. There was a deposition at Fort Bowie in January that they took because a lieutenant decided to take it, and a judge later decided he shouldn't have. And there was a federal indictment in Tucson in the spring under the Intercourse Act, which is a law about selling liquor and arms in Indian country, and is one of the very few laws in the history of this territory that ever went the right direction. Collie did not hang. Nobody hangs for whiskey. He got 4 years at Yuma and served 2.5, and I am told he opened a store in Deming afterward and did well. I got 9 head of horses back. 9 out of 31, and only because a judge in Wilcox got interested in Collie's paperwork generally and found the note had been assigned wrong. 411 acres of rock and 9 horses. The 10th wasn't returned. The 10th had never been taken. Nobody could get a rope on her. I found the marks in the corral dust the first morning after 4 men, and a lot of scrambling, and a piece of somebody's shirt on the top rail. And the Grella standing out in the north pasture 200 yards off with her sides heaving and blood on her forelegs where she'd gone through the wire again, over the old scars, right through them, same place. 7 years old, wouldn't be caught, wouldn't be kept. Would go through wire every time and open the same wounds every time and stand out there bleeding and free. And God help me, I don't know to this day whether that's a triumph or the saddest thing I ever saw. And I have decided that not knowing is probably the honest answer, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. She burned the paper herself. Not that night. 9 days later, when the deputy had gone and the horses were gone, and it was just the 3 of us and a lot of empty corral to look at. She came to the bunkhouse door in the evening and she said, "The tin." I got it, I brought it out. I didn't say anything. She took the paper out and read it, all of it, slow, both sides, which took a while, and I stood there the entire time and let her, and it was the longest 4 minutes of my life. Transfers all right, title and interest in the labor contract of the Indian woman known as Ruth. Then she folded it in half and put it in the fire, and we watched it go. She said, "That doesn't do anything." I know. There's a copy in his ledger and a duplicate in Tucson and a line in the agency book, and none of it goes away because a paper's burnt. I'm still on it. I'll be on it when I'm dead, and the book'll still say squaw of somebody. She watched the last of it curl. "It doesn't mean anything, Tandy." I said, "No." "Then why'd you look like that just now?" And I said, "Because I've been carrying it for 5 months and I'm tired." She was quiet a while. Then she said, "That's the first true thing you've said in this yard since September." And she went and sat down on the step, my step, the one with the 41 nails, and I have never once counted them since, not one time, which I noticed about a year later and had to go sit down about. Here's what I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you that we married or that we didn't. I'm not going to tell you whether she stayed, and if she stayed, whether it was 2 years or 20, and I'm not going to tell you about the nights, and I'm not going to tell you the word with the rain in it. You have read stories where the man gets the woman at the end because he was decent for a while. I bought her for $62. Whatever came after that, and it doesn't get to be a reward, and it isn't yours. I'll tell you one thing, and then I'll quit. In the fall of '85, a company of scouts came through the draw on their way to Bowie. 20-some men, Apache scouts in the blue coats, with a lieutenant who was about 19 and half dead from the heat. They watered at the seep. We gave them what we had. She stood in the yard. She stood in the yard with her hands at her sides, and she looked at every single face as they rode in, one at a time, 20-some faces. And I stood 40 feet off with my hat in my hands, and I did not move and I did not say a word. He wasn't in it. The lieutenant said B Company was still south, that they'd be down there till it was finished, that it'd be finished by Christmas. They said that every year, they said it 4 years running, and each year they meant it. They watered and they went. And she stood in the yard a long while after the dust settled, and I finally came up and stopped about 10 feet off, which was our distance, which it had been since the first day, and which I never once closed without being asked. I said, "There'll be others come through." She said, "Yes." I said, "We'll be here." And she turned her head and looked at me, and there was something in her face I'd never seen there. Not for me, not about me. I want to be clear, it wasn't about me at all. And she said, "You said we." I hadn't noticed. I'd been saying it for a month apparently. She'd been counting. She'd been counting the whole time. Of course she had. She'd counted every man in every yard she'd ever stood in, and every word, and every door and where the bar was on it, and she'd been doing it since she was 15, and she would do it until the day she died, and I had spent a year thinking I was the one who counted things. She looked back at the road, where the dust was going down. Then she said, "Come inside, it's